Hello and welcome to Insight. I'm Kusum Tilaka. My guest today, Talal Rafi, the economist at Deloitte Economics Institute and an expert member of the World Economic Forum. And on my right, Bram Nicholas, the economist and chief operating officer of ETIS, an economic training and information services company. Gentlemen, welcome to Insight. So these two gentlemen are here to discuss a range of economic topics, and we're going to try to keep things apolitical as far as we can, but with there might be slightly differing opinions on something. So let's get straight into it, gentlemen. Talal, I'm going to start with you. There's a lot that's been written about historical policy failures, and I think we will get to that very soon. I also want to just have a touch on what the audience can expect with economic indicators in the coming months and years, because how it's likely to impact our audience materially, impact their material lives. So before we get to that, can I just ask you, post IMF approval, we were told that there would be more funding that would materialize from the World Bank, the ADB, etc. Could you tell us if such additional funding has materialized as a result of the EFF facility being approved, and how do you think, your personal opinion on the reforms and how they've gone, how's the government handled them, that sort of thing?
Thanks, Kusum. Nice to be on your show. Thank you. So I think slowly the funding is coming through. Hopefully we can pass the IMF conditions and go for the second tranche as well. But as far as the reforms that are needed, we need to work on a number of structural reforms. So particularly one thing I would say is the first and most important thing that I have been talking about a lot, and also even the main opposition party had put it as its number one priority, is the independence of the central bank. So that's something, that's one of the core structural reforms that are essential. Because if you look at, just to give a brief summary of how we got here, one of the main reasons would be populist policies, and like for example, rice from the moon or bread at 2 rupee 50 cents. So historically, so it's mostly been funded by monetary financing or debt. Right. So monetary financing is, for example, the central bank basically printing money. So this has led to, for example, if you look at the primary budget surplus, we have only attained it 4 times in 75 years. Right. So we're not even talking about fiscal deficits. So with such discipline, it's usually like when you have large fiscal deficits, inflation rate is automatically higher. So that kind of explains why Sri Lanka has a consistently higher inflation rate when compared to countries in the rest of the region. And when inflation rates are much higher, it also results in interest rates being higher. So that the real interest rate has to be positive. So Sri Lankans have been borrowing at a higher cost. Right. And also when you have large fiscal deficits, it also results in the government borrowing from the banks, especially the state banks. So there's a crowding out effect. Right. So generally the cost for the rest of the private sector is also higher. Okay. So those are just a few of the reforms, but I can touch on a bit more if needed.
Thanks, Talal. So Bram, before we get to the central bank issue, because that's a question that I'm going to get to a little later on, could you give us your point of view on how you see the reforms having been implemented thus far and the quality of the government's work in that regard?
Yes, Kusum. Thanks for having me on the show. So I would say that generally, if I look at the policies that have been put forward by the IMF and the policies that seem to be put in place now by the government, there is very much a focus on two things, which Talal mentioned, is the fiscal consolidation and the reduction or stopping of printing of money. And I think because of that, something has been pushed into the background that should actually get, for me, the priority, and that is export-oriented industrialization. Because now what I'm seeing in the media and said by some of the policy makers is that basically we experienced a debt crisis as a country, and that we should look at what caused that and hence put in policies in place that deal with that problem. Now, looking at this problem as a general debt problem, for me, is the mistake. Because what Sri Lanka defaulted on was the external debt. It was not the government's inability to actually pay the debt in rupee terms. There were no dollars left to pay the interest on the external debt. So for me, it's really a question of how is the government planning to put in place structures that will allow Sri Lankan companies to earn the foreign exchange necessary to pay off interest in the future on external debt, import all the goods that Sri Lanka requires, and all the other expenses on the balance of payments. Because for 40 years now, Sri Lanka has had one of the largest trade deficits in the world. Money has been flowing out. And we know from evidence of the successful East Asian countries that the only way a country has ever gotten out of that trap is to go for export-oriented industrialization.
Okay.
So I would say that even though the argument can be made that the deficit was too high for too long and that too much debt has been accumulated, it's confusing the symptom with the cause for me. You know, this is the symptom of an economy that is not dynamic, is not growing fast, you know, is stagnant. And the government has had to try and prop that up. But to deal with that requires more of a long-term strategy. And we know what strategy works there.
Okay, so I see straight off the bat, you know, Talal, you have a focus more on the budget deficit side, and you have more focus on the trade account, the balance of payments account deficit side. So we'll get to both these as well as the Central Bank Act. So there's three things we're going to discuss a little further on. But if I can just anchor the conversation with where we are with the IMF right now, Talal. So over to you. If I can just ask you, the most recent data suggests that the Sri Lankan government increased revenue in the first quarter of this year by about 100%. So we've doubled our revenue, which is great. But then that is still short of the 500. So it was about 350 billion rupees in tax revenue for the first quarter. But as per the IMF's budgeting and how for our revenue benchmarks for this year, we have to reach something like 500 billion. So already we're sort of behind the revenue projections that the IMF have provided for us. So I just want to, I mean, we can't get into the intricacies of the tax structure, but how do you see this dynamic about being able to generate enough revenue as the stepping stone to many of the other reforms? I mean, how do you view that?
Right. So we are going a bit short on that. That's because the economy is still in a stage where it's contracting. So
Right.
we need to
If I can
focus.
interrupt, isn't it contracting by design, Talal? Aren't we meant to contract the economy right now to keep our demand down? To
Yes.
aren't
but
deflationary policies like? Isn't that the point of it?
Yes. So the priority right now is to get inflation under control. So with
Right.
the interest rates high, the priority, the focus is on inflation. So the effect is the economic contracting. But
Correct.
there are a number of other reasons as well. So in my view, controlling inflation is important. But as far as like getting the revenues up, I believe that we need to have more progressive taxes.
Yes.
Like for example, when you look at the tax structure, about only around 25 to 30% the taxes are from direct taxes. So
Right.
most are indirect.
Yes.
So when
It's
you
been a
have
problem we've had throughout our history.
throughout, yes. So even the tax revenue, I mean government revenue to GDP ratio was good. I mean in the mid 90s when President Premadasa, the senior President Premadasa was there, and then even at the first few years of President Chaka's rule, we had a government revenue to GDP ratio of around 20%.
Okay.
So it drastically went down. So the previous government brought it down to 8%, which is one of the lowest in the world. So here in this environment, it's going to be a bit challenging. But my suggestion is, we need to focus on the direct taxes,
Right.
because indirect taxes are affecting the poor. And so by this, for example, we live in a country where there are over 1 million cars. And even if you want to buy a car which is 10 to 15 years old, it's still around 3 million rupees. But how can people, like 1 million registered with cars, but only around 200,000 tax files, and even those are not active.
Right.
So we need to focus on these areas. So progressive taxes, and also I feel that tax slabs are a bit too narrow. We need to
Right.
widen it a bit.
Right,
So
because the
uh,
top
wi-
tax, the top personal income tax bracket is 36%.
Yeah.
Which, and there's no, so it doesn't matter how many billions you
Exactly.
earn per year, you're still capped at 36%.
Yes.
So that's a problem.
And since it's at a much lower rate, the amount. So even somebody who's like earning, for example, ₹1,000,000 a month, or somebody who's earning nearly 100 or 200 million rupees are paying exactly the same
Pretty much the
taxes.
same tax.
So there's a bit of unfairness. And also, I also would like to work on the government to work on ways where we can do direct cash transfers
Right.
rather than subsidies.
Okay.
Like one example is, for example, petrol has been subsidized. I mean, somebody who's driving a Land Cruiser in Colombo, he pumps petrol, so his fuel is subsidized.
Yes, yes.
So as 75% of the revenue comes from indirect taxes, some farmer probably in Monoragala or Hambantota is paying some sort of this thing money through taxes, indirect taxes,
To
pay
subsidize the Land
subsidized
Cruiser.
some person who can well afford to pay fuel prices
prices.
even 10 times high. So cash transfers, that would be one thing. So so
Okay.
these are priority areas.
Right. Bram, if I can just ask you, you can carry on the conversation from there. But I also want to add that the whole program of the IMF is about meeting a 2.3% of GDP primary account surplus by 2025. So, I mean, there's been some deliberation on whether this is even possible, and if we were to reach that sort of primary account surplus, is that feasible or sustainable for the public, for the working people, for the poorest people in the country? How do you view this this dynamic between trying to achieve this primary account surplus and the pain in the period in between, in the 2 years leading up to that, as well as anything you want to pick up on what Talal said?
Yeah, Kusum, as you said before, the target on tax revenue has already been missed. And even though these are supposed to be policies that have now been put in place to act deflationary, but the side effect has been a fall in real income as well. So we're seeing the economy contracting, obviously more than was expected, because otherwise the targets would have been met. Because that is the main issue, that even though the tax rates, which I agree with Talal, were way too low. I mean, there's no developing country that can sustain those types of tax rates, so they had to be raised. But then the issue also is, how do we get income up? Because in the end, that's what is being taxed. So you can raise all the tax rates you want, but if no one has the income to be taxed on, then, where are we headed? And again, I have to also agree with Talal that I would like to see more progressive tax policies be put in place, because I think now a disproportionate amount of the burden is being placed on the poor. And this, the fact that this lowest tax bracket was lowered from, 300,000 rupees a month to 100,000 rupees a month is, for me, beyond belief, especially because both the IMF and the government recognize that the poor need to be protected. They need social welfare and that safety net. But meanwhile, taxes are being raised on them to this extent. I find, a bit strange. So, indeed, I'd like to see more progressive tax policies implemented there.